Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Burcu Güneri, English lecturer at Atatürk University, and I'll be leading today Professor Michael Kent's keynote speaker session. As all of you know, Professor Kent is a professor of public relations and a Fulbright scholar. Kent has been teaching for more than 30 years. Professor Kent conducts research on dialogic theory, engagement, new technology, mediated communication, social media, international communication, and other areas. Kent has published more than 100 articles and books, including a public relation writing textbook. Kent received his doctorate from Purdue University, his master from the University of Oregon, and his bachelor's degree from the University of Alaska. He enjoys bookmaking, wood turning, carpentry, leatherwork, photography, lockpicking, and I need to warn you guys, he also loves knife making. So, Professor Kent, I hope you have never used the knives you've made before, have you?
I have a nice kitchen knife.
Okay, that's good then. It's not dangerous. So today he's going to talk about dialogic theory 2.0, enacting a human-centered world in society 5.0. So please welcome Professor Michael Kent. We're with you.
Thank you. Let me get my slides open here. I assume everybody can see those?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for inviting me today. It's always a great honor to have the opportunity to speak at a conference, and especially one on a topic that I have great interest in, such as this one. And already I got to watch part of the earlier panel and see what some of you were talking about. So I'm going to take you through my presentation here in one moment, and I understand we'll do questions at the end. So you can ask me face to face, or you can ask me, write down a question when the time comes. This box on my screen in just a second. There we go. And move that to the top here. How about that? It was different a second ago when we practiced this. All right. So the title of our presentation you have here, Dialogic Theory 2.0, enacting a human-centered world and society 5.0. And I want to start by thanking the program planners of Atatürk University and Dolo University. And also I want to thank Burcu Güneri for her kind assistance and for her invitation to come. It's, as I said, a great honor to be here. So I was invited to talk about dialogue, and also I want to talk about Culture 5.0, the conference theme. The purpose of a keynote address is typically to set the theme for a conference, to talk about the key issues that you're going to be confronted with, and also then to sort of set the tone for everybody else as the conference moves forward. So I'm going to try to do something like that. As Anthony Hilbrunner argued a number of years ago, he suggested that the critic's job is to seek the truth, tell the truth, and expose lies. My background is in communication and more specifically in rhetoric. And so I come from a criticism background where that's the sort of thing that I do all the time, is to seek the truth and hopefully tell the truth. I'm not looking to expose so many lies today, but hopefully I'm going to try to raise the conversation to the level to focus on what it is that we're doing here today. My apologies. Again, we tested the slides and everything worked fine. So as you know, probably, I'm sure most of you or many of you looked up what this Society 5.0 was about. And the initiative, which comes from the Japanese government, Society 5.0, was proposed here is Fifth Science and Technology Basic Plan with a vision towards creating a super smart society. And all throughout my notes, I put that in red and bold because I just thought it was sort of an amusing phrase to use to talk about this. The super smart society is positioned as the fifth developmental stage in human society, following the hunter-gatherer, pastoral, agrarian, industrial, and information, and represents a sustainable society connected by digital technologies. that attend in detail to the various needs of that society by providing necessary items or services to the people who require them, when they are required, in the amount required, thus enabling its citizens to live an active and comfortable life through high quality services, regardless of age, sex, religion, language, and so on. And I wanted to read that in some detail because it's got some interesting language in terms of what it puts forth as what's important and what it implies and what it doesn't imply. So that's what I'm going to try to take us through as I move forward, is to unpack some of these issues here and what this might mean. So let me see if I can get this to keep working. So now there's a great quote I ran across from Gladden. I looked at probably a dozen articles and a bunch of things from the Japanese government about this project to see what Society 5.0 was about. It's not something I have dealt with before, even though it's a couple years old. And Gladden says, the government of Japan's Society 5.0 initiative seeks to employ emerging technologies to create a super smart cyber-physical society that's more human-centered than our current information society. However, an apparent paradox exists in any attempt to create a more human-centered society that involves surrounding the society's human members with rapidly expanding quantities and kinds of social robots, artificial agents, and other artificially intelligent entities that do not simply exist as passive tools to carry out the instructions of human operators, but are instead able to learn, decide, and act for themselves in increasingly autonomous ways. Is such a society better understood as being more human-centered than past societies or less? And I think that's really the key here. When I first read this statement about what it was about, I was thinking, where are the humans in this human-centered society? I see a lot of stuff about machines. I know that we already have social media technologies that don't allow us to, sorry, I'm getting an error message about something. We have technologies that don't allow us to see what other people are watching if they have a certain political leaning or if they have a certain social interest. The tools already separate us from other people. And I'm curious about how much farther this could go in terms of leading to the super smart society. So I would start by saying that this super smart society will not be built on the backs of robots, AI, and big data for free, which I think we should understand. As the expression goes, there's no free lunch. This is a proposal from the Japanese government. So in essence, we expect the government to be supporting these projects, funding many of these projects, providing tax breaks or incentives to make these things happen. And I think that's one of the key issues here is going to be what's going to be the implications of that. I would argue, rather, there are two visions operating here, one that's stated and one that's implied, a dystopian vision and a utopian vision. And I would actually say that it's quite common, I think, for people not to really recognize the dystopian possibilities in utopian visions. I don't think it rarely runs the other direction. It's quite common for someone to come up with something well-meaning, such as this proposal we're going to look at here in a bit more detail, and conclude that, like, this is great, this is wonderful, this will be wonderful for society, but don't question much what it's going to mean for the people who live in that. And so I think if we look at some of the fiction, we actually get a sense of what are possibilities. The fiction that we had going back 100 years has, most of it has already been enacted. So if we think about the various things we've seen in films over the last century, we don't have all of that. We don't have ships that move faster than light. We don't have light speed. We don't dress like they do. If you look at some of those technology movies, you see that they got some pretty wild clothes. And we haven't adopted those future dresses that we're supposed to have living in the future. And for those of you who might be Star Trek fans, Star Trek The Next Generation, there's always a scene every couple episodes where Captain Picard talks about our violent past and how we've moved past that. And I'm not quite sure we've moved past that violent past. It strikes me that we're still having a lot of that going on all around the world. So if we turn to the utopian visions, okay, there's not been nearly as many utopian visions as there are dystopian visions. And actually, when I went looking for some of them for this presentation, I was struck by how many so-called utopian movies are listed that I'd never heard of before, because they just never, apparently they were never very popular and a lot of people hadn't seen them. But there's certain things that we see that these visions or these activities have in common. And I'd say in terms of the future, we have the future with technology, but there's also this big emphasis on culture. We see that in, you know, of course, these hundreds of episodes that have gone on the various Star Trek franchises, but then movies like Black Panther, where you have this technologically advanced society and people, you know, live in these cities and they have access to everything they need, but at the same time they're kind and they're loving and they're helpful to their neighbors, and they're not violent in the sense of violent to each other, but they'll defend themselves and protect themselves. So there's these themes that we have sort of radiating from this, you know, science fiction in our history about basically kindness and goodness that are part of these utopian visions. But I think we all would have to agree, especially after these last 2 years with COVID, that's hard to see very often. It's hard to see that we're getting there or that we're going there, especially when we've got the number of people that we have now who think the world is flat and don't believe the world is round, or who won't get vaccinated because they're afraid of implants and a whole bunch of other things. We have to ask, you know, how much of this dystopian world might we see, where in the dystopian visions, we see governments and people and organizations that watch us, that try to control us. People are frightened. And there's a lot of them where there's this visual metaphor going on, where sort of the rulers live above us in a floating city, and they're kind and they're clean, and it's a nice society where everybody likes each other. And down below, it's dirty, the buildings are falling apart, people are violent, people are angry. And I think that that vision is implied, both of these visions, I think to some extent, are implied when we start talking about culture 5.0 as being enacted with smart machines, and that by surrounding ourselves with these machines that are going to help us and make our life easier, that'll be great for the people in the floating cities. But I think for most of the rest of us, that's going to be a bigger concern, is what are we going to do, you know, just to put food on the table? So there are a couple ways we've thought about this. People have talked about this over the years. I think you can pick a metaphor. There's a couple big metaphors. There's Orwell's Big Brother and there's Huxley's Brave New World. So you've got the surveillance society, and you've got essentially a society where people voluntarily choose to give up their freedoms and to be watched. And I think of that as an oubliette. Oubliette's a French word for basically it's a dungeon. It's a place where you put people to be forgotten. You throw them into the hole and they're left in the oubliette to die. Well, we're not left to die with our new technology, with our social media, but we're perfectly happy being cut off from the rest of the world because we have this sense that we are connected. We can talk to our friends and we can read the media that interest us and we can hear from the politicians that we trust, but we've lost that encounter that we have with others. There's a dialogic term for it I'll talk about later. It's called the encounter with strange otherness. And that encounter with strange otherness is really a substantial feature of our experience with other people. I think I would say more so than in the recent past, but I would say growing up, most of us who are probably older than 40 maybe, remember that to make new friends, you had to go talk to people and you had to take a risk and you had to expose yourself to them. And there was no anonymity. There was no being anonymous. Anonymous was standing on the side at an event and not talking to people. But if you wanted to make friends, it required you to go out and do it. And I'm not trying to say this is better or worse, but I'm saying there's a difference between that and now, where people have a lot of friends who aren't their friends. There's a joke we used to tell when I lived in New Jersey, that friends will help you move and real friends will help you move bodies. And the idea is just basically that we don't have that many real friends. Real friends will help you do almost anything. But according to the research, we have the same number of real friends now in 2021 that people had 100 years ago. The average person only has about 3 really close friends, not counting close family members. And then we have a few people a little farther out, maybe up to a dozen people that include some colleagues that we work with and some other friends. And then in the old days, that was it. Of course, you didn't have a network of 1,000 friends, but now people then have these bigger networks. And yet we don't really have any more friends that we can trust. We live in this world where we're largely isolated. So what we have largely is what I might call narcissism, ignorance, and hedonism. this trend where people are interested in showing you what they're doing and taking selfies of themselves and taking selfies of their food and selfies with themselves and their food. And the question is, what's preparing us for this super smart society? According to the narrative, it's prosperous and it's human-centered. And currently, prosperous is questionable for a large segment of the world's population. Human-centered, again, we can say we're human-centered because we have access to social media, but that's hardly human-centered. Human-centered involves human beings who know us and legitimately care about us. And so the question is, who will do it? It's not going to be these technology companies. And the technology companies are the ones who are going to enact this. And the technology companies are the ones who are going to benefit from it the most. So as I was suggesting before, we could pick almost any dystopian movie made over the last 50 years. And we've always got this sort of division between the classes. And we have to ask, who's going to pay for all these smart machines and who's going to pay for these artificial intelligence assistants and everything else? I certainly don't believe that it's going to be free. It's not going to be something we give away. So the people who have the money and resources will be able to have those in their home. And maybe you'll have robots do your gardening, and maybe your robots will be able to drive you around, and your robots will be able to schedule your appointments. And that's great. It will mean more time for the people who have access to those resources, but it will create a bigger division for the people at the bottom. So if we look at this description, this is from the report by the Japanese bureau that put out this idea for Culture 5.0. There's these 12 items around the outside that describe the various aspects of it. Okay, value energy chains, new manufacturing systems, intelligent transportation, smart food chains, smart manufacturing, integrated material development, global environment information platform, hospitality systems, new business and services, socially resilient against natural disasters, infrastructure, regional inclusive care, and new manufacturing systems. Now, those sound a lot like exactly what we have now that are hardly very smart. So we can maybe create some artificial intelligence systems to help run them better, and we can maybe have a socially resilient against natural disasters. Sounds to me like a weather service that will predict risks to us, and maybe some technologies that will tell us to seek shelter in the event of a serious storm or some other event. But that doesn't seem all that human-centered, and I'm not quite sure how that will make me more prosperous. In fact, I'm not sure how anything on this list makes me as an individual more prosperous if I don't already own some stock in one of the companies that's going to build this infrastructure. So again, my point is not to critique them or call them out for what they're suggesting, but to say that we need to look at this a little further, and we need to subject this to more scrutiny. Tayettioni, who many of you probably have heard of, we often talk about as being one of the founders of the communitarian movement. Tayettioni, in '93, in a great book, Spirit of Community, wrote, "We have some duties that lay moral claim on us for which we derive no immediate benefit or long-term payoff." This was sort of the statement, the most important statement in the book when it came out in '93, was this idea that although we have rights, and of course, certain countries, I'm in Australia and we're quite an individualistic country, second only to the United States for individualism. And there's this sense that people have a right to do what they want and a right not to be told what to do by the government. But at the same time, Tayettioni said that may be so, but we also have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to our families. We have responsibility to our communities. In the case of educators, we have a responsibility to our students and to our colleagues. And he went on and said, when the term community is used, the first notion that typically comes to mind is a place in which people know and care about one another, the kind of place in which people do not merely ask, "How are you?" as a formality, but care about the answer. This we-ness is indeed part of its essence. I think we all would agree that a community that's just, so smart machines that talk to us and answer questions for us is not the same as a human being who we have a relationship with. Now, later, in a later piece, Tayettioni, and I think probably his son, Tayettioni, are suspicious of artificial intelligence. They have a nice essay where they talk about the need for corporate and government watchers as well as personal moral watchers. He uses this anecdote of a self-driving automobile. As an example of the self-driving cars. And he talks about how AI systems, if they're artificial intelligent and they're self-learning, there's a very great chance they're going to learn some bad habits. If you think about driving, you know that there are people who tailgate, and you know that there are people who go over the speed limit. In fact, I would say most people at some point drive over the speed limit. Now, we often hear about these self-driving cars like Elon Musk's, creations, and other kinds of other companies have made self-driving cars. And we're told that they have special systems to make sure that they don't run over pedestrians or dogs, and they're designed to keep you safe. But an artificially intelligent system is very different than that. It will learn, and it will see things, and it may observe that other vehicles on the road do things that, although they may be questionable from a safety standpoint, might be more efficient at getting the driver where they want to go. And there's no reason to believe that a system, a self-driving system that's capable of making decisions, isn't going to occasionally make some bad decisions. So what Tayettioni was talking about in this essay was basically that he said that we're going to need watchers. We would expect that there's probably going to be government watchers who have to make sure that companies who create these technologies are not taking advantage of us and making sure they're safe. And then there'll probably be another level of watchers of the watchers to basically make sure that the systems that the self-driving car people are going to put in a system to make sure it doesn't make a mistake. The government's going to have to watch to make sure they're doing what they're told. And then the insurance company is going to want to have watchers to make sure those systems are doing what they're told. And that all seems, I think, fairly reasonable. And then he suggested, though, we probably will also need an ethical system, our own personal moral watchers that can make decisions based on our own values, that can guide. If artificial intelligence is going to make decisions on our behalf, and it's not going to, if we're going to set aside the evolving into Terminator robots that destroy society, then they have to be able to make moral decisions. They have to be able to make human-based decisions, and we have to be able to have input in that. We can't let the robots just decide on what the robots will do. We have to be able to say the robot should be able to do this, but they should not be able to do that. Now, interestingly, Neil Postman actually said this almost exactly. He asked this question: what problem outside of leisure do these smart machines solve? Around 20 years ago, he was giving a book tour for his book, How to Build a Bridge to the 18th Century. And he's actually a graduate of the University of Fredonia in upstate New York in the United States. Somebody's child. And I worked at Fredonia at the time, and I got to meet him and have dinner with him a couple of times. He's really hilarious. Well, he's deceased now, but he was really hilarious. A very nice man. And he gave sort of this tour, and I do recommend the book. The book is brilliant, Building a Bridge to the 18th Century. But he basically asked this question about cars. You had a car that they wanted to buy a new car, and they told him it has power windows. And he said, well, what problem does that solve? I don't have problems rolling down my window. And this is the same kind of question as what problem are we solving with Leisure 5.0, with these smart machines? What are the things that we really need? So I did crunch some numbers, did some Google searching, and I have nothing against capitalism and people making self-driving cars or other technologies. But it turns out that only 1 in 10,000 people die in car crashes in the United States. And in Turkey, it's about half that number. And the leading cause of death in Turkey is actually heart disease and cancer. Automobile deaths is number 7, and it's more or less the same. I think automobile deaths is number 11 in the US, but heart disease and cancer are at the top of the list. This seems like something the government should be working on to me. This seems like something that is an order of magnitude more dangerous of people having a heart attack or getting cancer than it is that they need self-driving cars. And in many ways, self-driving cars seems like a luxury that, as I mentioned, is going to not be something that everyone has. The people who are working class will still not have a self-driving car. And so these technologies don't really seem poised to bring happiness and a better life to everybody. When we talk about Society 5.0 as a tool for reducing human suffering, and you look at those bubbles I mentioned, right? Not one of the 12 smart technology areas talks about anything about health, about accidents, and the major cause of death in most countries is what we call accidents, which is a whole range of things. And you can't really prevent somebody from, falling over the edge of a boat and drowning, or, getting hit by a hammer falling off a roof from a carpenter. But accidents are a whole bunch of things. But there are many preventable things. Suicide is one of the biggest causes of death in many countries. Gun violence in the United States is kills 3 times more people than automobile accidents does. 37,000 people killed with handguns in the US. So I have to ask, who benefits from this smart society? Actually, to be more specific, I want you to ask this question. The purpose of, I think, my raising this is to point this out and for us to start thinking about it, is that I think all of these are important things, right? Energy value chain, smart food systems, smart manufacturing, hospitality systems. But at the same time, I don't think these are the most important things facing society. As was noted in one of the previous presentations, I think probably the first presentation right before this one, there was some discussion about climate change and environmental issues and weather problems and risks that people face. And that is a much more significant problem for every single person on this planet right now than whether we have smart machines that can help us do things for us. So Society 5.0, described by the Japanese government as the super smart society, aims to create a society where people can resolve various social challenges by incorporating innovations such as AI, robots, and big data into society. And I ask, where are the social challenges? Where are the social challenges on that previous slide? What social challenges are we confronting? If we look back here, right, hospitality systems, okay, the social challenge of having a hotel that loses your booking or something, that's a very serious issue we have to deal with, is, having hospitality services. And so Society 5.0 seems more like an essay I wrote in 2001 about the World Wide Web. When the World Wide Web was still relatively new, I started studying it, and I was curious about what the possibilities were. And it was a little confusing at first because there was no one there to teach you how to do things. You had to figure everything out yourself. So I started looking at what are the top, searches. And if you recall, this was before Google Scholar and all of the fancy search engines that we have now. There were a couple search engines, but most of them, like Alta Vista, were not all that great. And when you looked at the data, you discovered that the most common search term on the internet was pornography. In fact, the top 25 search terms on the internet in 2001 were all pornography related terms, as well as a few business terms thrown in. So at the time, you had the president in the US and you had leaders all over the world saying the internet is the greatest thing that's ever happened. It's going to equalize society. It's going to allow people to have access to knowledge and information that they didn't have. We should bring it to schools and we should bring it to every classroom. And that was the point actually that caught my attention was, should we be bringing something to schools and the classrooms that's number one purpose currently is to bring people pornography or to sell stuff to people? And although that largely resolved itself by 5 or 6 years into it, Amazon.com had come along, people started using the web for commercial purposes. We started having the evolution of social media and some other kinds of things. Oh, I have a spelling error right there. I feel so embarrassed. Things changed and they evolved, which is to be expected. And we would expect Society 5.0 will change and evolve. But we have to recognize that the current formulation of this is quite simplistic, and it's very much assuming this sort of unstated metaphor that technology can solve our problems, not that people will solve our problems. So let me come back around then to the topic of my address. What's the point of all this? I was told that he's going to talk about dialogue, and where's the dialogue? So for more than 2 decades, I've studied dialogic theory. I've studied dialogue in the web. I've studied dialogue in social media. I've studied, new technology in general, their potential, what is possible, what can organizations do with it. And as I mentioned, the notion that some organizations know what's best for everyone is, as I say here, misguided and dangerous. This idea that you can trust the people who are in the business of getting, exceedingly wealthy from creating these technologies and tools to do the right thing, You certainly know of all the scandals that have happened to Facebook over the last few years, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where they were basically giving away data, letting companies have unfettered access to people's personal information, to more recently, the leaked papers that suggested that Facebook actually doesn't care about children or its users, which I actually think the fact that anybody's surprised by that is sort of stunning. So although, as I say, self-driving cars are cool, they're nice, right? I actually, to be honest with you, 5 years ago, kind of wanted a self-driving car. When I thought they were a little safer, I thought, oh my God, that'd be so great. I could just get in my car and tell it where to take me. But to be honest, as I get a little older now, I'm in my 50s, I think I'd rather know there's a cure for cancer. If I get cancer, there's maybe a cure for heart disease, or if I have a heart attack, they're more likely to be able to save me. I'd like that my government is prioritizing that. And as I mentioned, climate change, I think, is almost certainly the biggest topic facing the entire planet. And this idea that we can ignore it and we'll just come up with some magic solution down the road, but today we're not going to care, just reflects a real lack of awareness about science and technology and what's going on. So with the rest of this, I want to just move to basically focusing now on some dialogue so that you can feel like you got your money's worth, okay? We need to design smart systems, but not in the sense of culture 5.0, but in a dialogic sense. We need smart systems that allow us to collaborate, question, build relationships, take risks, trust other people. And there's a great phrase in a paper, an article I wrote a few years back by the tech guy who used to work for a blog called Slashdot, and he works for the Washington Post now. He said, we have to learn how to lift up the smartest people. If you've ever been in a chat group with a bunch of people, you know that the vast majority of the conversation is quite simplistic. If you look at most comments in social media, they're just very banal, oftentimes insulting, unkind, not very thoughtful. And what he was saying is we need to learn to find a way to bring the important stuff to the top. How do we get the good comments to rise to the top? And as a quick aside, Slashdot actually came up with a system for that, where as a reader, it's a blog, a technology blog. It's still going, I believe, Slashdot, I think it's slashdot.com. Slashdot came up with a system where you could rate the quality of other people's posts. And you were asked as a member about once a month to be part of this panel. And if somebody made a good comment, you could give it some extra points, extra thumbs up. And if it was a bad comment, you could give it thumbs down. And what it meant was when somebody made a good comment, other people recognized it. And so you could then filter how many of the levels, 5-star comments, 4-star comments, 3-star comments, 2-star comments, 1-star comment, what's the quality level of the comments you want? If you limit it to 5-star comments, you would see brilliant feedback. I used to regularly, when I had time to read it regularly, I used to see comments from Nobel Prize winning scientists and from very, well-known professors. And so the blog, was read by tens of thousands of people, and the people commenting ran a whole gamut from, high school students to Nobel Prize winners. But the ability to bring the important stuff to the top is really a crucial skill that we haven't mastered with almost any of our social media. We don't know how to use it to do that. And that's really what we need to be able to do with dialogue, is to be able to have the model be about the principles of good communication, the principles of ethical and humane communication, and not about some sort of ability to put more money into the pockets of tech companies, which I'm not opposed to them making a profit. I'm just opposed to my government's priorities being about that. So let me just briefly take you through the principles of dialogue now, for those of you not familiar with what is dialogue, what is all of it about, why is he telling us about this? There's about a dozen principles, and briefly, I'll just give you a quick summary. So positive regard. Dialogue, first off, is both an orientation and a process. So we come to a relationship or an interaction dialogically, which means we're prepared to have an interaction where we're going to be honest, where we're going to try to trust the other person, where we're going to value what they have to say, where we're going to treat them kindly. But at the same time, there's also a set of principles for how to do it. things that you should do if you want to maximize dialogue. If you're going to say, this was a positive dialogue, these things should happen. So as I said, positive regard, right? We have to have a tone of politeness. We have to be culturally sensitive. We have to know something about the people we're talking to. Vulnerability, this personal self-disclosure. I think you all know that people who are your friends know more about you than people who aren't your friends. And your close friends know more about you than the people who are less close to you. And probably your family know more than almost anybody else. But that vulnerability, that willing to risk, that's how we build relationships. And when we don't trust somebody, or we don't trust a corporation, we don't trust an organization, we don't self-disclose, we don't share information. So vulnerability and a couple of these are especially important. And unanticipated consequences. Unanticipated consequences is when, as it suggests, you did not expect that to happen. If you're going to engage in a dialogue, you have to be open to unanticipated consequences. I remember one of the first times I became aware of it was in college. I was having a discussion with a friend of mine who was planning to become a lawyer. And I did this sort of classic, like, oh, lawyers, they defend criminals, how can you have a job where you defend criminals? How can you feel good about that? And my friend told me, we actually discussed this probably for an hour. And at one point he explained to me that like our justice system rests on the principle of innocence until being proven guilty. And if lawyers didn't defend the guilty, the whole legal system would fail, right? We can't have a legal system premised on innocence if people decide who's guilty before they are given a trial. And I remember thinking that, wow, I've never thought of it that way before. It was a compelling argument. I was changed, right? That and unanticipated consequences, you have to have the potential for it. You have to be willing to be wrong. And a great many, I would say almost everybody hates being wrong. But a great many people are just unwilling to admit they were wrong. It's just sort of physically incapable. And you can't move forward. You can't move forward as a human being. We can't move forward as a society if people can't admit when they're wrong. So the unanticipated consequences, this concept of strange otherness, where we encounter someone, we've just never experienced somebody who lived that life. I grew up in Alaska, and it's quite cold, as you probably know and might guess. And there are things you do when you live in a place where it's minus 50. When it's minus 55 Celsius, it's almost exactly the same in Fahrenheit. So when it's minus 55 degrees, you need to be prepared. What happens if my car breaks down? What happens if the heat goes out in the house? What happens if you end up having to walk somewhere or something? So you live your life in a particular way to be prepared for it. And the same is true of people who live in the desert. I've come to Australia now, and there's a lot of land in the middle of Australia that's not particularly habitable, and yet people have lived there for centuries perfectly fine, right? Because they know how to do it. And so that encounter with strange otherness is when you encounter somebody who has that otherness that is so different than what you've experienced, and you're able to take something from it. All right, mutuality, which is basically the concept that dialogue rests on this recognition that you both are important, both of the people involved have a stake in it. And I'd also note that in general, dialogue is not about a group setting. You can't have a dialogue with a room full of people. You can have a dialogue if it's moderated and people take turns and it's very carefully done. You can have a formal dialogue. Like I said, there's sort of two kinds of dialogue. You can do a formal dialogue with more than a couple people. But in practice, a dialogue is something that typically takes place between 2 or 3 people. So you've got collaboration, which I think is self-explanatory. You have to be willing to work with somebody else. You've got empathy, which is not to be confused with sympathy. Both sympathy and empathy are considered features of dialogue, but empathy is the ability to put yourself into somebody else's shoes, to sort of come to terms with what they're experiencing. You don't have to agree, and that's one of the central things about dialogue. Dialogue is not a decision-making tool. It's not designed to build consensus. If you're using it to try to get everyone to agree, then you're actually not doing dialogue, because in a dialogue, you should be able to come away completely unchanged. If you were open to change, you of course should be changed if it's warranted. But a dialogue isn't about you changing yourself. A dialogue is about understanding other people, learning from other people, appreciating what they have to say. You've got confirmation. The concept of confirmation is basically acknowledging the the other person, being sympathetic to the other person and their views, trying to help the other person participate. I think we probably, all of us who teach, experience this issue of confirmation, where we have to try to encourage students to participate, help them feel comfortable, especially with technologies that many of them have, don't have a lot of experience with. When new students come and they have to try to use these tools. So we have this sense of confirmation, of commitment, where we try to understand the other person's views, of genuineness, where we try to be honest and truthful, we're not being deceptive. And that brings us to a couple others that for some reason I didn't put on my list here. But one of the biggest, the central tenets of dialogue is the concept of risk. Why not have risk on here? If you're not willing to risk, you cannot build a relationship. And if you're not willing to risk, people won't trust you. Trust and risk go hand in hand. So if you want to be able to encounter a person, to be open to the encounter with strange otherness, it involves risk and it involves some sense of trust. So commitment to the conversation basically means you're going to continue what you're doing. Commitment to interpretation means you're going to realize that when you don't understand somebody, we don't talk about fault. If I don't understand something you said, it's not your fault because you were not clear. Nor is it my fault for not understanding you. If you said it and I didn't understand it, no one's at fault, because communication is an energy must be expended system. There's a great article I can point you to that talks about the Second Law of Thermodynamics, and arguing that the Second Law of Thermodynamics is what describes communication, because there is no process in which I speak and you understand and you speak and I understand. There's a whole process of interpretation that goes on in our heads. And so communication takes work and dialogue takes work. And the last concept is psychological readiness, which basically means you've prepared for this. You've come to this encounter in a way that you're open to what might happen. Okay, so I'm on the last slide where I just want to make a few final points, a list of what I'm going to call the Dialogue 2.0 principles, and then I'll wrap up after that. So Dialogue 2.0 is an attempt to take us sort of past dialogue. For 20 years, myself and lots of other people have said, is social media dialogic? Can we use social media to be dialogic? How can we use social media for dialogue? And my response at first was maybe. And then my response a few years later was probably not. And then my response now is, I think it's possible, but we don't know how to do it. So here are some of the things I've discovered through various articles and writings and research and thinking that I think help move us forward on this idea of Dialogue 2.0, which I think ties in very well with Culture 5.0. And the first is about this awareness of the architecture of the social media around us. Social media all have different features. They have different different tools that we can use. They have a different architecture. Some of them have persistent conversations. Some of them, the conversations disappear. Some of them are video based. Some of them have larger text features. And depending on the architecture, we can do different things as communicators. One of the things I always find amusing is that academics like listservs, and so many non-academics don't. Like we love sending around messages to people, long messages on lists, and people can respond to them. To be honest, we don't always love that, but I've never heard one of my colleagues say, "Oh, I wish I could put pictures in this. I wish I could post a picture of something here." We have social media for that, but we also recognize that for complex ideas, the written word is one of the best tools, short of face-to-face. So knowing the architecture better. The second is the concept of the rhizomatous nature of dialogue. And by that, I've written about how dialogue needs to be an ongoing process. We need to recognize that it should be something we don't start just to achieve a goal. Like I mentioned before, it's not to solve a problem, it's not to make a decision, it's not to take advantage of somebody, it's to build a relationship with somebody. So it should be rhizomatous. And then there's a concept called tertius jugens that I've written about before. Tertius jugens is this concept of what we call the third who joins. In network theory, there's this concept of tertius gardens. And the tertius gardens is basically a person who's able to control the network. It has to do with centrality. It has to do with structural holes. And the tertius gardens basically can manipulate the system to maximize the communication or the information for two parties. But the idea of tertius jugens is that we can extend that to say it's not about excluding a third party to my benefit. It's about bringing the third party in so that we all benefit from it. And so I think it's a much more compelling concept than, especially when we talk about networks and how they tie into social media. The idea of conviviality goes back about probably close to a century. And the concept of conviviality is that our tools should be easy to use. They should, the concept that they used to use, and I've been reluctant to use, is that they open a conversation with the user. And I say I'm reluctant because the whole idea of sort of smart machines and that sort of thing is that they do have a conversation with the user, but it's not the same kind of conversation. A convivial tool is easy and makes you feel good and it's rewarding. And we had convivial tools before we had social media. And so conviviality, I think, is one of the key things we need to have an understanding of. We need to understand theory better and the possibilities of what we can and can't do with our technologies. We have all of these social media theories that, we have all of these social media tools and these internet assumptions that are based on ideas that come from television, that come from radio, that come from print, but we actually have no genuine social media theories about how social media works. The way we might look and read McLuhan for ideas about television or the media, we don't have the equivalent for social media. And so we need to build some of that. Better understanding of storytelling, because we exist because of stories. We tell stories. We said we were going to go to the moon and humans went to the moon. We say that we're going to do something and we do it. We tell a story. We construct that reality. And the reality we construct guides us our whole lives. Some experience that we had as children can be something that dictates the way we behave for the rest of our lives. And so storytelling isn't trivial. We construct the reality of other people as communicators. And so we have to understand the power of storytelling. Negative spaces is a concept that just basically says dialogue doesn't work everywhere. There are places where you can't use dialogue and we should know the difference. And then the call for an expectation of genuine engagement. I know, again, earlier, the previous speaker was speaking about engagement and engaging with various groups and publics. Engagement is key to dialogue, being able to have effective engagement and bringing people in. And then a concept I've written about called the fourth persona. The fourth persona is the voice of the people who should be included. So we have four personas that we've talked about over the years. The first persona is the I of the person, this person speaking. And the second persona is this implied public. And the third persona are the publics that are left out. And the fourth persona are the publics, in my view, that we need to include. It's our active inclusion of groups that have a voice in something. And finally, this concept of homo dialogicus. We contrast this in an article with homo economicus. And homo economicus is basically where we use an economic model, a business model, to make our decisions about what to do, which is exactly what Culture 5.0 is. It's a homo economicus model. It's a business model for smart machines that is going to make a lot of people rich and a lot of people happy who can afford it. And I rather doubt the rest of us will get as much from it. All right, so hopefully you don't come away from this thinking that I'm anti-technology or that I have anything against Culture 5.0. My occupational psychosis is communication and dialogue. So when I read these things, I start questioning, I'm saying, well, where's the people in this? Where is the culture in this? It's called Culture 5.0, but I don't see any culture in this. And so there's that. That's my talk for today, and hopefully you got something out of it. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have at this point.
Thank you, Professor Kent, for your brilliant talk. While you were talking, I think the most important point is a shift from homo economicus to homo dialogicus thing, because I think the capitalism prevent us to think like a human being. That's what I think. And while you were talking about the watchers and the watchers of watchers, I found myself thinking, what professional could be the watchers and the watchers of the watchers, and who's gonna be the top watcher?
Yeah, and I actually think that in that article he talks about too having our own personal ethical watcher, that we'll have our own personal AI. I think the closest metaphor is kind of like, Marvel's Iron Man, where Iron Man has his, little computer Jarvis or whatever, right? And Jarvis is sort of his own personal computer assistant who does everything for him. And I think that's actually the metaphor. He wrote this before, before the movie ever came out. But I think that's the metaphor, is that you'll have this sort of personal AI assistant who sees the world the way you do, who shares your values.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, you can use the chat or you can turn on your microphone and you can ask Professor Kent your own questions. Please feel free to ask. Okay, I think everybody understood well what is the dialogic theory, because it was a brilliant thing, a brilliant topic, and you have changed my attitude towards technology. I was seeing technology as a kind of bad thing because it's not for the working classes or the lower parts, lower members of the societies. But now I'm thinking if we can use technology better, better for people, not for the capitalism or not for the big companies, I think we can make a big difference, huge difference. And now I believe that we can use technology if we're not going to think about money a lot, to the good things as well. So thank you for honoring us. I'm asking again, do you have questions? Yes, sure, please.
Kenan?
Have a question.
Hello. I'm Canandra Atasoji from Mersin University. Hi, everybody, and thanks for the conference. Hi, Professor. I am dealing daily life and the relation with social media in a information age, and I want to learn your opinion about the relation with the dialogic theory and the social media, and as we are interacting online and as we are continuing our everyday life in these online areas, online platforms, how can you describe the relationship? Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. Now we're at Professor Kent.
So I'll try to give you a reasonable answer. So each of those articles I went through at the end, each of those are articles where we're working through that question. So it's a big question that you're asking. Mm-hmm. And I would say, I think one of the first things that's crucial is that we start making this part of what we teach students about, that we start preparing the generation that's coming up on learning to be more dialogic and learning to be more open to interacting with others and less suspicious. We have to move away from, we do have to move away from the system we have of surveillance and, everyone's gives all their information away and organizations take advantage of us. The big issue with all dialogue is trust. And if you think about any job you've ever had or your organization, your school you might work at, it's common, I think, everywhere in the world, assistant professors never say anything. Assistant professors sit there with their mouth shut, and they don't want to make any waves and they're concerned about it. And that shouldn't be the case, right? In an intellectual institution, assistant professors should be able to participate like that, but they still don't talk because we're still concerned. When I was assistant professor, I didn't say anything and I kept my mouth shut. And so what I would answer it with is just the biggest part of it is it has to come from the person with power. The person who, the organization or the person, the manager, has to create a system in which people believe that they're not at risk, where they believe they can trust. And that's the hardest part, I think. One of the hardest parts is creating that atmosphere of trust. And if people have that atmosphere of trust, they will risk and they will share and they will interact. But as long as people have that fear, then you're not going to have dialogue or it will be hard.
Mm-hmm. We will definitely be happy.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Hopefully that was helpful.
Okay, so is there any other questions? I see there is no other questions. So it's a great pleasure to meet you, Professor Kent, and thank you for honoring us and sharing your learnings and experiences and your knowledge. And hope to see you again in the next Communication in the Millennium Symposium. And have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a great conference. I'll be going to bed soon, but you guys are going to have like a whole day.
It was great. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.